The Newport mansion still stands today on Bellevue Avenue, though locals refuse to speak its name aloud. Behind its pristine marble facade and manicured gardens lies a truth so disturbing that 3 generations of Rhode Island families have conspired to bury it. Between 1861 and 1863, 7 men died mysteriously within those walls, all connected to the same woman, all bearing the same symptoms: violent convulsions, blackened fingernails, and the unmistakable bitter almond scent of arsenic poisoning. What makes this case truly horrifying isn't just the methodical nature of these murders, but the revelation that emerged decades later from a sealed courthouse basement. The killer was aided by her victim's own family members, including the very people she was poisoning. Before we continue with the story of Margaret Aldridge and the Newport poisoning ring, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, buried by wealthy families and hidden from history books, are exactly what we uncover here. And please, let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We've received messages from viewers who've actually visited these historical locations, and your local insights always add incredible depth to these investigations. The truth about what happened in that mansion began to surface only in 1924, when renovation workers discovered a hidden compartment behind the library walls, containing documents that would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about one of Newport's most respected families. Newport, Rhode Island, in the spring of 1861, was a city caught between 2 worlds. While the industrial North braced for war with the Confederate South, Newport's elite lived in unprecedented luxury. Massive fortunes built on textile mills, shipping routes, and international trade had transformed this coastal town into America's playground for the wealthy. The famous summer cottages, mansions that rivaled European palaces, lined Bellevue Avenue like monuments to American capitalism. Among these architectural marvels stood Ravenscroft Manor, the 40-room estate of the Aldridge family. Built in 1847 with Italian marble, French crystal, and mahogany imported from the Caribbean, it represented everything the American aristocracy aspired to become. The house commanded a stunning view of the Atlantic Ocean, its windows reflecting the morning sun like golden eyes watching over the coastline. Margaret Aldridge, at 47, was considered one of Newport's most formidable matriarchs. Widowed 3 years earlier, when her husband Edmund perished in what was reported as a tragic riding accident, she had assumed control of the vast Aldridge fortune with remarkable efficiency. Her sharp intelligence and business acumen impressed even the most skeptical men of Newport society, who grudgingly admitted that Edmund's death had revealed his wife to be far more capable than anyone had imagined. Those who knew Margaret described her as a woman of striking presence rather than conventional beauty. Tall and slender, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they surveyed, she possessed an almost hypnotic ability to command attention in any room. Her dark hair, now touched with premature silver, was always perfectly arranged in the latest fashion. She dressed expensively but conservatively, favoring deep blues and blacks that emphasized her pale complexion and gave her an air of perpetual mourning that men seemed to find both mysterious and appealing. Margaret's daughters represented the future she was determined to secure. Eleanor, 23, was everything a young lady of good breeding should be: beautiful, accomplished, and blessed with a gentle disposition that made her popular among Newport's eligible bachelors. Her younger sister Catherine, 21, possessed a more spirited nature and sharp wit that occasionally worried her mother, who preferred obedient daughters to independent thinkers. The Aldridge fortune was substantial but not unlimited. Edmund had made several poor investments before his death, and the approaching war threatened to disrupt the shipping routes that provided much of the family's income. Margaret understood that her daughters' marriages would determine not just their futures, but the survival of the family's position in society. A poor choice of husband could mean the gradual decline of everything the Aldridges had built. It was against this backdrop of social pressure and financial uncertainty that Eleanor announced her engagement to Charles Whitfield, a handsome 26-year-old from a respected Boston family. Charles possessed exactly what the Aldridges needed: youth, charm, connections to northern textile money, and most importantly, a substantial inheritance that would become available upon his marriage. He was tall and well-built, with dark hair, and the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege. His education at Harvard had prepared him for a career in law, and his family's political connections suggested a bright future in Boston society. The engagement, announced in February 1861, was celebrated as a perfect match by Newport's social elite. Charles was clearly smitten with Eleanor, writing her long letters filled with poetry and declarations of eternal devotion. Eleanor, though more reserved in her affections, seemed genuinely happy with the arrangement. The wedding was planned for June, allowing time for the elaborate preparations that such a union required. Margaret threw herself into the wedding preparations with an intensity that surprised even her closest friends. She personally oversaw every detail, from the selection of Eleanor's dress fabric to the arrangement of flowers in the cathedral. She insisted on hosting Charles at Ravenscroft Manor for extended visits, claiming that she wanted to know her future son-in-law as well as possible. These visits became more frequent as the wedding approached, with Charles often staying for days at a time. What no one in Newport society understood was that Margaret's attentiveness to Charles stemmed from something far more sinister than maternal concern. From the moment she met him, she had recognized in Charles something that excited her in a way she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't love. Margaret Aldridge was incapable of such vulnerability. It was the thrill of the hunt, the recognition of a worthy challenge, and most importantly, the identification of an opportunity that could solve all her financial problems permanently. The first sign that something was amiss came on a warm evening in April 1861. Charles had been staying at Ravenscroft Manor for nearly a week, ostensibly to discuss wedding arrangements and review legal documents related to the merger of their family estates. The household had settled into its usual evening routine. Eleanor practicing piano in the music room, Catherine reading in the library, and the servants cleaning up after dinner. Margaret found Charles alone on the terrace overlooking the ocean, smoking a cigarette and watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in a silver light that made the scene appear almost theatrical. She approached him slowly, carrying 2 glasses of brandy and wearing a silk evening gown that accentuated her still impressive figure. "You seem troubled, Charles," she said, offering him one of the glasses. "Surely not by thoughts of marriage to my daughter." Charles accepted the brandy gratefully, though he noticed that Margaret's proximity made him inexplicably nervous. There was something in her manner, a subtle shift in how she looked at him, how she stood just close enough that her perfume filled his senses, that felt inappropriate for a future mother-in-law. "Not troubled exactly," Charles replied, taking a sip of the exceptional brandy. "Just thinking about the future, the war, the changes coming to our world. Sometimes I wonder if we're all living in a kind of dream that's about to end very abruptly." Margaret moved closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. "Dreams can be dangerous things," she said softly. "They make us forget what's real, what's important. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are right in front of us, but we're too distracted by fantasies to see them." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Margaret skillfully guiding Charles through topics that revealed his deepest anxieties and desires. She learned about his financial concerns, his doubts about his legal career, his fear that he might not be worthy of Eleanor's love. With each revelation, she positioned herself as someone who understood him better than anyone else ever had. What Charles didn't know was that Margaret had been studying him for weeks, learning his habits, his weaknesses, his schedule. She had read his correspondence with Eleanor, searching for insights into his character. She had made discreet inquiries about his family's finances, discovering that his inheritance was even larger than she had hoped. Most importantly, she'd been adding small amounts of a mild sedative to his evening brandy. Nothing dangerous, just enough to make him more susceptible to suggestion and less likely to maintain appropriate boundaries. That night, As they stood together on the terrace, Margaret made her first move. It was subtle, a hand placed on his arm to emphasize a point, a laugh that lingered just a moment too long, a compliment about his intelligence that came with a look that spoke of deeper appreciation. Charles, already confused by the unusual intimacy of their conversation and the effects of the drugged brandy, found himself responding despite his better judgment. "You're not at all what I expected," he admitted, his voice slightly slurred. "When Eleanor described her mother, I pictured someone different, more conventional." "And what do you think of me now?" Margaret asked, her steel-gray eyes fixed on his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Charles struggled to find appropriate words, but the brandy and Margaret's proximity made clear thinking impossible. "I think," he said slowly, "that Eleanor is very fortunate to have learned grace and intelligence from such a remarkable woman." It was exactly the opening Margaret had been waiting for. She stepped closer, close enough that her breath warmed his neck as she whispered, "Some lessons can only be learned through experience, Charles. Some forms of education require a more personal approach." The seduction didn't happen that night. Margaret was far too clever to rush such a delicate operation. Instead, she planted seeds of desire and confusion that would grow over the following days. She withdrew, just as Charles seemed ready to cross a line he couldn't uncross, leaving him frustrated and guilty, unsure of what had almost happened or why he felt such a strong pull toward his fiancé's mother. Eleanor, practicing piano in the music room, heard only the murmur of voices from the terrace and assumed her mother and Charles were discussing wedding details. Catherine, reading in the library, noticed that Charles seemed agitated when he came back inside, but attributed it to pre-wedding nerves. The servants, well trained to be invisible and deaf to their employers' private conversations, observed nothing that wouldn't be expected in a house preparing for a society wedding. But Margaret's lady's maid, Sarah Connolly, a sharp-eyed Irish woman who had served the family for 15 years, noticed something that troubled her deeply. As she helped Margaret prepare for bed that night, she saw her mistress examining her reflection in the mirror with a satisfaction that seemed inappropriate for a woman whose daughter was about to marry. "You seem pleased with the evening, ma'am," Sarah ventured carefully. Margaret smiled, but it wasn't the warm expression of a happy mother. It was the cold, calculating smile of a predator who had successfully identified her prey. "Yes, Sarah," she replied, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. "I believe everything is proceeding exactly as it should." The next morning brought unsettling news that would cast the first shadow of suspicion over Margaret's carefully constructed world. Dr. William Hensley, the family physician who had attended Edmund Aldridge during his final illness 3 years earlier, arrived at Ravenscroft Manor with a deeply troubled expression. He had come, he explained to Margaret in the privacy of her study, because of disturbing rumors circulating among Newport's medical community. "There have been questions, Margaret," Dr. Hensley said, accepting the tea she offered with obvious reluctance. "Questions about Edmund's death that I frankly hoped would never arise." Margaret's expression remained perfectly composed, though her hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she poured her own tea. "Questions? What sort of questions could there possibly be about a riding accident?" Dr. Hensley was a man of 62, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much suffering over the decades. He had attended the births of Margaret's daughters, treated the family through various illnesses, and considered himself a friend as well as a physician, which made what he had to say even more difficult. "Edmund's symptoms before his death," he continued reluctantly. "The convulsions, the digestive distress, the way his fingernails darkened in those final days. At the time, I attributed everything to internal injuries from the fall, but other physicians have suggested that the progression was more consistent with poisoning than trauma." Margaret set down her teacup with perfect steadiness. "Dr. Hensley, surely you're not suggesting that my husband was murdered. By whom and why?" "I'm not suggesting anything," he replied quickly. "I'm simply telling you that questions are being asked, questions that could become very uncomfortable if they reach the wrong ears." What Dr. Hensley didn't tell Margaret was that the questions had originated from an unexpected source: Charles Whitfield himself. During a dinner party the previous week at the Vanderbilt mansion, Charles had mentioned Edmund's death to Dr. James Morrison, a physician from Boston who specialized in cases of suspected poisoning. Dr. Morrison's casual questions about the symptoms had revealed details that made him deeply suspicious, and he had shared those suspicions with colleagues in Newport's medical community. Charles's interest in Edmund's death hadn't arisen from suspicion, but from his legal training. He had been reviewing the Aldridge family's financial documents in preparation for the marriage contracts, and had noticed several irregularities in the timing of Edmund's will changes and insurance policies. Edmund had made substantial modifications to his estate planning in the months before his death, changes that heavily favored Margaret and gave her unprecedented control over the family finances. Margaret thanked Dr. Hensley for his concern and assured him that she welcomed any investigation that might put such terrible rumors to rest. But after he left, she sat alone in her study for nearly an hour, staring out the window at the Atlantic Ocean and calculating her options. She had always known this moment might come, had always prepared for the possibility that Edmund's death would eventually attract unwanted attention. What she hadn't expected was that the threat would come from Charles himself. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would transform her from a woman who had killed once out of desperation into something far more dangerous. She would not merely survive the investigation into Edmund's death, she would use it to eliminate every threat to her security permanently. Charles's suspicious inquiries had revealed him to be more dangerous than she had initially realized, but they had also shown her exactly how to turn that danger to her advantage. The plan that began forming in Margaret's mind was breathtaking in its audacity and horrifying in its implications. She would seduce Charles, not just to steal him from Eleanor, but to make him complicit in a scheme that would secure the Aldridge fortune forever. She would use his legal expertise to help her create the perfect series of accidents that would eliminate everyone who posed a threat to her secret, including her own daughters if necessary. But first, she needed to ensure Charles's complete cooperation, and she knew exactly how to achieve it. Late that night, as the household slept, Margaret made her way to Charles's guest room. She had drugged his evening brandy more heavily than usual, ensuring he would be in a state of confused arousal when she arrived. What happened in that room over the following hours would bind Charles to her in ways that made backing away impossible. The documents discovered in 1924 included Charles's own handwritten confession, sealed in an envelope marked, "To be opened only upon my death." What that confession revealed about his first night with Margaret Aldridge was so shocking that the authorities considered burning it, rather than preserving it as evidence. If you're finding this story as disturbing as we are, hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. These are the kinds of buried truths that powerful families spend fortunes to keep hidden. Meanwhile, Eleanor slept peacefully in her room just down the hall, completely unaware that her engagement had just become something far more sinister than a simple betrayal. She didn't know that her fiancé was no longer just unfaithful. He was now an accessory to murder, bound to her mother by secrets that would eventually destroy them all. The transformation in Charles over the following days was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew him well. Eleanor noticed that he seemed distracted during their conversations, often staring off into space with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she asked if something was troubling him, he assured her that everything was perfect, but his smile seemed forced and his eyes held a strange new intensity. Catherine, whose sharp wit made her more observant than her gentle sister, noticed that Charles had begun seeking out private conversations with their mother at every opportunity. She found them together in the library one afternoon, sitting closer than seemed appropriate, their voices dropping to whispers whenever she entered the room. When she mentioned this to Eleanor, her sister dismissed it as natural. Of course, Charles wanted to establish a good relationship with his future mother-in-law. What Catherine and Eleanor couldn't have imagined was the true nature of those private conversations. Charles, still reeling from his night with Margaret and the shocking revelations she had shared with him, was being systematically drawn into a conspiracy that would make him complicit in crimes he had never dreamed possible. Margaret had revealed everything to him. Edmund's murder, the forged documents, the carefully planned accident that had made her a wealthy widow. But she had presented it all as a desperate act of self-defense against an abusive husband who had threatened to destroy her and her daughters financially. She claimed that Edmund had been planning to divorce her and leave her penniless, forcing her to choose between her family's survival and her conscience. "I never wanted to become this person," she told Charles during one of their secret meetings, allowing tears to flow down her cheeks with practiced precision. "But when faced with the choice between my daughter's future and my own soul, what mother wouldn't sacrifice everything to protect her children?" Charles, already compromised by his physical relationship with Margaret and struggling with guilt over his betrayal of Eleanor, found himself drawn deeper into her web of justifications and half-truths. Margaret's version of events painted her as a victim forced into terrible choices by circumstances beyond her control. She was so skilled at mixing truth with manipulation that Charles began to believe he was helping to protect Eleanor and Catherine rather than endangering them. The first task Margaret gave Charles seemed harmless enough, using his legal expertise to review the family's estate planning documents and identify potential vulnerabilities that could threaten their security. Charles threw himself into this work with genuine enthusiasm, grateful to find a way to contribute to the family's welfare that didn't require him to examine his own moral compromises too closely. What Charles discovered in those documents should have terrified him. The pattern was unmistakable once he knew what to look for. Edmund's death had been preceded by a series of careful changes to wills, insurance policies, and property deeds that maximized Margaret's benefit while minimizing outside scrutiny. Even more disturbing, he found evidence of similar patterns surrounding the deaths of two other men connected to the Aldridge family. Margaret's first husband, who had died in a boating accident before Charles was born, and Eleanor's former fiancé, Thomas Richardson, who had died in a carriage accident just months before Charles began courting Eleanor. Thomas Richardson's death was particularly suspicious because Charles had known him slightly at Harvard. Thomas had been healthy, athletic, and an experienced horseman who was extremely unlikely to lose control of his carriage on a familiar road in good weather. The circumstances of the accident, a sudden panic in his horses on a calm evening leading to a crash that broke his neck, made little sense to anyone who knew Thomas's skill with horses. Charles confronted Margaret with his discoveries, expecting her to be shocked by the implications. Instead, she calmly confirmed his worst suspicions. Thomas had indeed discovered something about Edmund's death that made him dangerous, and Margaret had been forced to act to protect herself and her daughters. The other deaths, she claimed, had been genuine accidents that unfortunately created a pattern that could be misinterpreted by suspicious minds. "You see why I need your help," Margaret told him, her hand resting on his arm with intimate familiarity. "Someone with your intelligence and legal training is essential to ensure that no more accidents are necessary. With your help, we can secure the family's future without anyone else getting hurt." Charles was horrified to realize that part of him found Margaret's calm pragmatism about murder almost admirable. She wasn't a mad woman or a sadist. She was a cold-blooded strategist who eliminated threats to her family with the same methodical planning that a general might use to win a war. In his compromised state, he began to rationalize her actions as necessary evils, even as his conscience screamed that he was becoming complicit in unspeakable crimes. The final step in Margaret's seduction of Charles came when she revealed the full scope of her current plan. Eleanor, she explained with maternal concern, had become suspicious about her engagement and was asking uncomfortable questions about Thomas Richardson's death. Worse, she had been corresponding with relatives in Boston who might be able to piece together the truth about the family's history of convenient deaths. "I love my daughter," Margaret said with what seemed like genuine anguish, "but she's young and naive about how dangerous the truth can be. If she continues investigating, she'll not only destroy herself but bring scandal down on all of us." including you, Charles. Your association with this family would ruin your career and your reputation permanently. Margaret's solution was elegantly simple and absolutely monstrous. Eleanor would have to suffer a tragic accident before she could expose the family's secrets. It would be heartbreaking, but it was the only way to protect everyone else, including Catherine, who was still young enough to build a new life away from Newport's gossip and suspicion. Charles's horror at this suggestion should have driven him to flee Ravenscroft Manor immediately and report everything to the authorities. Instead, he found himself asking practical questions about timing and methods, as if he were reviewing a legal contract rather than planning his fiancée's murder. The transformation was complete. Charles Whitfield, who had arrived in Newport as an honorable young man planning to marry for love, had become Margaret Aldridge's willing accomplice in a scheme that would kill the woman he had promised to cherish and protect. Eleanor's first concrete suspicion came on a rainy morning in early May, when she found Charles and her mother examining a bottle of wine in the cellar beneath Ravenscroft Manor. They were standing close together, speaking in urgent whispers, and when they noticed her approach, both fell silent with the guilty expressions of conspirators caught in the act. "We were just selecting wine for tonight's dinner," Margaret explained smoothly, though Eleanor noticed that neither of them was holding the bottle anymore. "Charles has developed quite an appreciation for our cellar." Eleanor smiled and accepted the explanation, but something about the scene troubled her. The bottle they had been examining was covered in dust, clearly one of the older vintages that Margaret usually reserved for special occasions. More puzzling, Eleanor was certain she had seen Charles slip something small into his jacket pocket just before she appeared. That evening at dinner, Eleanor paid closer attention to the interactions between her mother and fiancé. She noticed the way Margaret's fingers lingered when passing Charles the salt, how their eyes met with understanding when discussing seemingly innocent topics, how Charles seemed to hang on Margaret's every word with an intensity that went far beyond polite interest. When Eleanor mentioned that she had received a letter from Thomas Richardson's sister in Boston, asking questions about the circumstances of his death, the reaction from both Margaret and Charles was immediate and telling. Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Charles actually dropped his wineglass, sending red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like spilled blood. "How clumsy of me," Charles said, his voice strained as he reached for his napkin. "I can't imagine why Miss Richardson would be asking such questions after all this time." "Grief affects people differently," Margaret replied carefully, signaling for a servant to clean up the spill. "Some people can't accept that accidents are simply accidents. They need someone to blame." Eleanor found herself studying her mother's face as she spoke. Margaret's expression was perfectly controlled, but there was something cold in her eyes that Eleanor had never noticed before, a calculating quality that made her feel suddenly unsafe in her own home. Later that night, Eleanor made a decision that would put her in mortal danger. She decided to search Thomas Richardson's personal effects, which had been stored in the mansion's attic after his death. If there was something suspicious about his accident, she reasoned, there might be evidence among his belongings that would explain why his sister was still asking questions. What Eleanor found in Thomas's trunk made her blood run cold. Hidden beneath his clothing was a leather portfolio containing detailed notes about Edmund Aldridge's death, including medical observations that cast serious doubt on the official story of a riding accident. Thomas had been investigating Margaret, documenting inconsistencies in her account of Edmund's final illness and collecting testimony from servants who had witnessed strange behavior during that period. Even more disturbing was a letter Thomas had written but never sent, addressed to the Newport police chief. In it, he laid out his suspicions about Margaret systematically, citing specific evidence and requesting a formal investigation. The letter was dated just 3 days before his own death. Eleanor sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by Thomas's belongings, and realized that the man she had almost married had died because he had discovered the truth about her father's murder. Worse, she now understood that her current engagement was somehow connected to the same deadly pattern. Charles's strange behavior, his secretive conversations with Margaret, the way both of them had reacted to news of Thomas's sister's inquiries, it all pointed to a conspiracy that put Eleanor herself in terrible danger. The sound of footsteps on the attic stairs sent ice through Eleanor's veins. She quickly hid Thomas's portfolio under her skirt and pretended to be examining his clothing with nostalgic sadness. But her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain whoever was coming could hear it. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, carrying a lamp and wearing a concerned expression that no longer seemed genuine to Eleanor's newly suspicious eyes. "My dear, what are you doing up here so late?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp as she surveyed the scattered contents of Thomas's trunk. "Surely it's not healthy to dwell on such sad memories." "I was just remembering," Eleanor replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Miss Richardson's letter made me think of him. I thought perhaps there might be something among his things that would comfort her." Margaret moved closer, and Eleanor caught a whiff of her perfume mixed with something else, a faint, bitter scent that seemed oddly familiar, but which she couldn't quite identify. "That's very thoughtful of you," Margaret said, "but I'm afraid stirring up old grief might do more harm than good. Some wounds heal better when they're left undisturbed." The way Margaret emphasized the word undisturbed made Eleanor's skin crawl. There was a clear warning in her mother's tone, a suggestion that continuing to investigate Thomas's death would be unwise. Eleanor realized with growing horror that she was no longer looking at her mother, but at a stranger, a dangerous stranger who had somehow replaced the woman who had raised her. "Of course, Mother," Eleanor said, forcing herself to smile. "You're absolutely right. I should focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past." Margaret smiled back, but Eleanor could see calculation behind the expression. "Exactly, my dear. Your wedding is only weeks away. That should be your only concern now." As Margaret turned to leave, Eleanor made a discovery that confirmed her worst fears. A small glass vial had fallen from her mother's pocket, rolling across the attic floor to stop near Eleanor's feet. The vial contained a white powder and was labeled in Margaret's handwriting, "For headaches, use sparingly." Eleanor recognized the vial immediately. Margaret had been carrying identical bottles for years, claiming they contained medicine for her frequent headaches. But Eleanor now realized that the bitter scent she had detected on her mother was the same smell that had been present in the house during her father's final illness and during the weeks before Thomas Richardson's death. The white powder wasn't headache medicine. It was poison. And Eleanor understood with crystalline clarity that she was living in a house with a woman who had murdered at least 2 men and was planning to kill again. The question was, who would be Margaret's next victim? Eleanor's instincts told her that she herself was in immediate danger, but logic suggested that Charles, as Margaret's co-conspirator, would be safe. What Eleanor didn't know was that Margaret had already decided that Charles knew too much to be allowed to survive much longer, and that both of them were now living on borrowed time. The poison Margaret used was arsenic, readily available in 1861 as a rat poison and easily disguised in food or drink. Medical knowledge of arsenic poisoning was limited, making it the perfect murder weapon for someone clever enough to use it sparingly over time. If this revelation is sending chills down your spine, you're not alone. Hit that like button if you're as horrified as we are by Margaret's calculated cruelty. And make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to reveal how Eleanor's discovery led to a confrontation that would determine whether she lived to see another day. What Eleanor couldn't have known as she hid that vial and tried to appear normal was that Margaret had already begun adding small amounts of arsenic to both Eleanor's and Charles's food, testing to see how much each could tolerate before showing symptoms. The headaches Eleanor had been experiencing for the past week weren't stress from wedding preparations. They were the first signs of arsenic poisoning. Eleanor spent the next 3 days in a state of controlled terror, trying to act normally while secretly preparing to save her own life. She began avoiding meals whenever possible, claiming nervous excitement about the wedding was affecting her appetite. She started carrying Thomas Richardson's evidence portfolio with her at all times, hidden beneath her clothing. knowing it might be her only proof of Margaret's crimes if she needed to seek help. The confrontation came on the night of May 15th, 1861, exactly 1 month before Eleanor's scheduled wedding. She had discovered Margaret and Charles in the wine cellar again, but this time she had hidden on the stairs and listened to their entire conversation. What she heard confirmed her worst fears and revealed the full scope of their murderous conspiracy. "The dosage needs to be increased," Margaret was saying, her voice calm and businesslike. "Eleanor is showing resistance, and we can't afford to let this drag on much longer. The wedding is in 4 weeks, and she needs to be incapacitated before then." Charles's voice was strained with guilt and fear. "Margaret, I can't. Watching her suffer like this is destroying me. There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Margaret replied coldly. "Eleanor has seen too much, knows too much. If you hadn't been so careless with those documents, we wouldn't be in this position, and your sudden attack of conscience is rather touching, but it's far too late for second thoughts." "What about Catherine?" Charles asked. "She's been asking questions too." Margaret's laugh was chilling in its casual cruelty. "Catherine will be heartbroken by her sister's tragic illness, of course. So heartbroken that she'll need to travel abroad to recover. I'm thinking somewhere remote. Perhaps a sanatorium in the mountains where the air is thin and accidents are common." Eleanor pressed herself against the stone wall of the staircase, struggling not to gasp aloud at the implications of her mother's words. Margaret wasn't just planning to kill her. She was planning to murder Catherine as well, eliminating both daughters to secure complete control of the family fortune. "And after?" Charles's voice was barely a whisper. "After Eleanor and Catherine are gone, what happens to us?" Margaret moved closer to Charles, and Eleanor could hear the rustle of silk as her mother's dress brushed against him. "We'll be free, Charles. Free to be together, free to enjoy the life we've created. Think of it, all of Newport society believing we found comfort in each other after losing poor Eleanor. It's almost romantic." What Margaret didn't tell Charles was that she had already decided he would be her next victim after Catherine's death. Charles had served his purpose by providing legal expertise and helping with the murders, but he was ultimately too weak and guilt-ridden to be trusted long-term. A few months after their grief-stricken marriage, Charles would suffer a tragic accident, leaving Margaret as the sole heir to both the Aldridge and Whitfield fortunes. Eleanor had heard enough. She crept back upstairs, her mind racing with plans for escape. She needed to get away from Ravenscroft Manor immediately, but she also needed to ensure that Margaret's crimes were exposed and that Catherine was warned about the danger she faced. The portfolio of evidence was crucial, but Eleanor realized it wouldn't be enough on its own. She needed witnesses, official support, and most importantly, she needed to survive long enough to tell her story. The sound of footsteps coming up from the cellar galvanized Eleanor into action. She hurried to her room and quickly packed a small bag with essential items, including Thomas Richardson's evidence portfolio. She wrote a brief note to Catherine, warning her sister about Margaret's plans and begging her to flee the house immediately. Then she waited by her window, watching for an opportunity to escape without being seen. The opportunity came near midnight when both Margaret and Charles retired to their respective rooms. Eleanor slipped out through the servants' entrance and made her way across the grounds toward the stable, intending to take a horse and ride to Newport's town centre, where she could seek help from the authorities. She had almost reached the stable when a voice called out from behind her, "Going somewhere, my dear?" Eleanor turned to see Margaret standing in the shadow of the mansion, still wearing her evening gown, but now carrying something that glinted in the moonlight. As Eleanor's eyes adjusted, she realized with horror that her mother was holding a revolver. I couldn't sleep," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought some fresh air might help." Margaret stepped closer, the gun never wavering from its target. "With a traveling bag? How thoughtful of you to pack for your midnight stroll." Her voice was still controlled, but there was a dangerous edge that Eleanor had never heard before. "I'm disappointed in you, Eleanor. I had hoped we could handle this quietly without unpleasantness, but it seems you've inherited your father's stubborn streak." Eleanor realized that running would be useless. Margaret was too close, and the grounds offered little cover between the stable and the gates. Her only chance was to keep talking and hope that someone might hear or that Margaret might make a mistake. "I know everything," Eleanor said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Thomas's investigation, father's murder, your plans for Catherine and Charles. You can't kill all of us and expect no one to notice." Margaret's smile was cold and satisfied. "Can't I? Watch me." She raised the revolver, her finger tightening on the trigger. The gunshot that followed echoed across the estate grounds like thunder, shattering the peaceful night and alerting everyone within miles that something terrible had happened at Ravenscroft Manor. But the bullet didn't find Eleanor. Instead, it went wide as Margaret stumbled backward, crying out in pain and surprise. Catherine had struck her mother from behind with a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, having followed Eleanor outside after finding the warning note. The blow hadn't been intended to kill, but it was powerful enough to send Margaret sprawling across the gravel pathway, the revolver spinning away into the darkness. "Eleanor, run!" Catherine shouted. But her sister was already moving, racing toward the stable with Catherine close behind. They could hear Margaret behind them, screaming with rage and pain, her voice carrying across the grounds like the cry of a wounded animal. "You ungrateful little bitches!" Margaret shrieked, struggling to her feet despite the blood flowing from the gash on her head. "I gave you everything. I protected you from poverty and disgrace. This is how you repay me." The sisters reached the stable and quickly saddled 2 horses, their hands shaking with adrenaline and terror. Behind them, they could see lights appearing in the mansion's windows as servants awakened to investigate the gunshot. But they also saw a more terrifying sight. Charles emerging from the house, carrying a lantern and what appeared to be another weapon. "She's calling for Charles," Catherine gasped as they mounted their horses. "They're both going to come after us." Eleanor looked back at the mansion one last time, seeing Margaret silhouetted against the light from the open front door, blood streaming down her face but very much alive and furious. "Then we'd better make sure we reach town before they can organize a pursuit." The sisters spurred their horses forward, galloping down the long drive toward the gates of Ravenscroft Manor. Behind them, they could hear shouting and the sound of other horses being prepared, but they had a crucial head start. The ride to Newport's town centre would take 20 minutes at full gallop. If they could maintain their lead, they might reach safety before Margaret and Charles could catch them. As they rode through the moonlit countryside, Eleanor pulled Thomas Richardson's evidence portfolio from her bag and handed it to Catherine. "If something happens to me," she shouted over the thunder of hoofbeats, "make sure this reaches the authorities. It contains proof of everything. Father's murder, Thomas's investigation, all of it." Catherine took the portfolio, her face grim with determination. "Nothing is going to happen to either of us," she replied. "We're going to survive this, and we're going to see Margaret hang for what she's done." But even as she spoke those brave words, Catherine could see riders behind them in the distance, gaining ground rapidly. Margaret and Charles had organized their pursuit faster than the sisters had hoped, and their fresher horses were slowly closing the gap. The chase ended at the Newport town square, where Eleanor and Catherine's desperate arrival at full gallop, screaming for help, awakened half the town and brought the night constable running from his post. The sisters' story was so wild, so impossible to believe, that under normal circumstances they might have been dismissed as hysterical young women suffering from pre-wedding nerves. But Thomas Richardson's evidence portfolio, combined with the sisters' detailed knowledge of Margaret's crimes and the dramatic arrival of Margaret and Charles in pursuit, convinced the authorities to take immediate action. Dr. Hensley, summoned from his bed to examine the evidence, confirmed that the medical observations in Thomas's notes were consistent with arsenic poisoning, and that he had harbored similar suspicions about Edmund Aldridge's death. Margaret's arrest came at dawn on May 16, 1861, as she sat in Ravenscroft Manor's drawing room, calmly sipping tea and acting as if nothing unusual had happened. When confronted with the evidence against her, she maintained her innocence with such convincing dignity that some observers began to doubt the charges. It was only when arsenic was discovered hidden throughout the house, In her bedroom, the kitchen, even sewn into the lining of her favorite coat, that her facade finally cracked. Charles's fate was more complex. His confession, written in a jail cell while awaiting trial, revealed the full extent of his complicity, but also painted him as a victim of Margaret's manipulation. The document, discovered decades later, described in horrifying detail how Margaret had seduced him, compromised him, and gradually transformed him from an honorable young man into an accessory to murder. "I believed I was protecting Eleanor," Charles wrote in his confession. "Margaret convinced me that silence was the only way to keep Eleanor and Catherine safe. That exposure would destroy them as surely as the truth would destroy me. By the time I understood that Margaret intended to kill Eleanor regardless, I was so deep in her web of lies and crimes that escape seemed impossible. I tell myself that I would have found the courage to resist eventually, but in my darkest moments, I know that cowardice and desire made me her willing accomplice." The trial of Margaret Aldridge became one of the most sensational cases in Rhode Island's legal history. Newport's elite society was rocked by revelations about the respectable widow who had systematically murdered her way to wealth and security. Newspapers across New England covered every detail, from Margaret's cold demeanor in the courtroom to the dramatic testimony of her own daughters. Margaret never admitted guilt, maintaining until the end that she was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by ungrateful children and ambitious prosecutors seeking to make their reputations. She claimed that Edmund's death had been a genuine accident, that Thomas Richardson had died in an unfortunate carriage mishap, and that her daughters had fabricated evidence out of greed for their inheritance. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. Arsenic was found in hair samples taken from Edmund's exhumed body. Thomas Richardson's body, when examined, showed clear signs of arsenic poisoning that had been missed during the original investigation. Most damning of all, medical examination of Eleanor revealed significant levels of arsenic in her system, proving that Margaret had indeed been slowly poisoning her own daughter. Charles received a sentence of 20 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy, though he served only 12 before dying of consumption in his cell. His final letter, written to Eleanor just before his death, begged her forgiveness and expressed his hope that she had found the happiness that his weakness had nearly destroyed. Margaret Aldridge was sentenced to death by hanging, making her one of the few women to receive capital punishment in Rhode Island during that era. She was executed on October 13, 1862, maintaining her innocence to the end. Witnesses reported that she walked to the gallows with perfect composure, dressed in her finest black silk gown and showing no emotion beyond mild irritation at the crowd's behavior. Eleanor and Catherine inherited what remained of the Aldridge fortune after legal fees and restitution payments, but they chose to leave Newport forever, selling Ravenscroft Manor and moving to California, where they could begin new lives away from the scandal. Eleanor never married, dedicating her life to helping other women escape dangerous domestic situations. Catherine married a doctor and had 4 children, but she never spoke publicly about the events at Ravenscroft Manor. The mansion itself stood empty for nearly 20 years before being purchased and demolished. The new owners, a shipping family from Boston, built a completely different house on the site, claiming they wanted no connection to the building where so many people had died. Local legend held that the original house had been cursed, though the truth was far more mundane. No one wanted to live in a place so thoroughly associated with Margaret Aldridge's crimes. The case of Margaret Aldridge raises disturbing questions about how many similar crimes might have gone undetected in an era when women were considered incapable of such calculated violence and when medical knowledge of poisoning was limited. How many loving mothers and devoted wives might have been hiding similar secrets behind facades of respectability and social standing? What do you think of this story? Do you believe Margaret's actions were those of a desperate woman driven to extremes, or was she simply a cold-blooded killer who used societal expectations about women to mask her true nature? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale of family betrayal and hidden murder, Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into history's darkest secrets. Share this video with someone who loves true crime and historical mysteries. These stories need to be told, no matter how disturbing they might be. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore another case of buried truth and family secrets that powerful people hoped would never see the light of day. The truth about Margaret Aldridge and the Newport poisoning ring remained buried for over 60 years, known only to the families directly affected and a few legal professionals who kept the records sealed. It was only when those 1924 renovations uncovered the hidden documents that historians began to piece together the full scope of her crimes. Even today, some details remain mysteries. How many men did Margaret actually kill? Were there other victims whose deaths were never connected to her? And most chilling of all, how many other Margaret Aldridges were there in Victorian America, hiding their murderous natures behind the masks of respectability and maternal devotion? These questions may never be fully answered, but the case serves as a stark reminder that evil often wears the most innocent faces, and that the most dangerous predators are often those we trust most completely.